I think it is God's Attributes Part 3, if I'm not mistaken. And we have begun to talk about God's essence, or what He is. And we have talked about the concept of God's aseity or aseity, which basically means that God is of Himself. He is of Himself. He is by Himself, self-existing, self-sufficient, self-contained, absolute in His being. So that led us to speak of God's simplicity in distinction from the creature. And I think this is the importance of establishing these points at the outset so that we may be reminded of the creator and creature distinction. A lot of the heresies and aberrations when it comes to God's knowledge comes from blurring that distinction, from blurring the distinction between the creator and the creature. We just recorded a program in Saints and Sinners today that has to do with that. I recommend it. I think a lot of good points and insights were addressed there as far as some of the early heresies and how the right knowledge of God leads to the right understanding and practice of doctrine. And the doctrine of God is one that we have neglected, or one that at least we get partially right. And there is a part of that we're not familiar with, acquainted with, and dealing with, and applying to our everyday lives and our everyday communication of the gospel and of the Word of God. So we've been talking about God's simplicity, God's aseity, and a few things that we have said in this distinction of the creator from the creature that we want to remind ourselves of. And then we began to deal with the treatment of this author of God's simplicity that we want to finish today. We began last week, but we didn't finish it, and we want to finish it tonight. And it is found in this little booklet, The Trinity and Introduction, by Scott R. Swain. So we're going to go through his treatment of the topic of God's simplicity, which I think is great, very succinct, very brief, but yet very encompassing of the topic. And then we want to look at a couple of documents from confessions, from our Reformed confessions, that also very interestingly address this topic and make it very prominent in the confession of the church. Before we do that, let us read. We have read several passages in the Scriptures that provide grounds for the treatment of God in His aseity and His simplicity. And one such passage is found in Colossians chapter 1, where it says that He, Christ, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by Him all things were created, that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through Him and for Him. And He is before all things, and in Him all things subsist or consist. And He is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things He may have the preeminence. So we see that it is in the revelation of redemptive history, in the revelation of Christ, in God's self-disclosure in the Scriptures, that we come to see who God is. We need special revelation to be able to come at these concepts and at these conclusions. And we see that in the Son who is, the Bible says, as we read in other passages, the express imprint, the express image of the Father. So He is the same substance, the same essence with God. And then we also saw in John chapter 1 that he was at the beginning with God, and that he is God, and that in him was life. And his life was the light, and he was the light of men. So we see this God revealed in the Son, and obviously that deals with the personality of God, God as a person that we will also address later. He has disclosed himself. He has related to his creation. And he relates to his creation in that act of special revelation, communication in the history of redemption, in the revelation of the Son, in the covenant of grace, which is the outworking of the covenant of redemption. But then we see that the same thing is applied to the Son when it comes to life of himself. It says here, he is before all things, and in him all things subsist. And in him was life, and that life was the light of men. So we have said then that God's existence is identical with his essence and with his attributes. So that's something that we put out at the beginning. To say that God is to speak of how or what he is. So to say that God is life is to say what he is like, how he lives. To say, and we could also say the other way around, to say that he is to speak of how or what he is. And to say what he is to say what or how he exists. And I know that sounds kind of hard to grasp, but that is in distinction from the creature. To describe human essence is not necessarily to require the existence of a man or of a human being, right? So in humanity, we separate essence from existence. We can speak of the characteristics of human nature without necessarily saying that human nature is or must be, right? So we speak of human nature, we speak of humanity, and then that existence, that particular individual or that humanity is instantiated in an individual, right? An individual that then has the qualities, the capacities, the attributes of his essence or the essence of humanity. Not so with God. Existence and essence are identical. To say that he is to speak of what and how he is. And that is why the name I am, which basically denotes that the existence of God is what his essence is of his essence. And that the attributes of God are not simply potentialities or capacities in the nature and the essence of God, but that he exists in the full being, act, and expression of those attributes. So we said then that God is pure being, pure act. He doesn't go from existence to then growth, potentiality, and then actualizes or realizes himself. So he is what he is, and he exists in the how and the what of his personality. Okay? He is life. He doesn't come into life. He doesn't become or arise in life. He doesn't possess life added to his essence or nature. He simply is life. And that is pure distinct. That's of the essence of the distinction with the creature, which we are always derived. We derive our existence from God. Our existence is caused by God. Our essence is derived of God, right? And not only are we, so God is not derived. He is uncaused. He is eternal. That's why the theologians have addressed or called that pure being. Pure being. There is no beginning. There's no end. There is no reception or anything from another source. He is pure being, pure essence. And then he's also pure act, because he is also a personal God, and we're going to get to that, in the sense that he has a mind, a will, his pure mind, his pure will, his pure act. He's not moving in the sense of growing, emoting in the sense of emotionality. He's not being acted upon, whether from within or from without, in some sort of growth and coming to express and come to completion of an action. He lives in his essence and existence and pure act within himself. Hopefully this will become more clear as we continue to unfold what we are going to say today and what we will say as far as the personality of God that subsists in three persons. This is the intra-Trinitarian life of God. He is rational, he is relational, and he is moral or spiritual. Okay? And in those three areas, he is in the rational area or dimension, his pure mind, his pure reason. In the relational aspect, he is a pure bond, pure act of relationality and sharing himself in the subsistence of the three persons of the Trinity. And in the moral and spiritual sense, he is the absolute good. And there is no good outside of him. He exists basically for himself. He loves himself. He is pure act of being in those attributes of relationality within the Trinity forever and ever. He has been, he is, and he will be in those same dynamics, so to speak, of pure mind, will, purpose, of bond, a mutual bond and sharing, and interdwelling fully and absolute of persons, and the pure good and love of this God that is one in three and three in one. So God is going to communicate himself in the economy of redemption. And it has been said that the Trinity in the economy of redemption is a reflection of the Trinity of how God is within himself. And we will address that when we get to it. But this kind of rounds up what we want to say as far as God's attributes as he is within himself, in his aseity and in his simplicity. Let us finish then what this author gives us when it comes to the simplicity of God. And he says, the identity of God with God and the lack of all composition in God is what Christians affirm when they confess the doctrine of divine simplicity. To confess a simple, non-composite God is to say he's not compounded of parts or of genus and species, or of substance and accidents, or of potentiality and act, or of being and essence. And those are the categories that now he explains. So let's take the first one. God is not composed of parts. Unlike human beings, God is not a composite of body and soul. God is spirit, not flesh. Nor is God composed of metaphysical parts. God is not part light and part darkness, part this and part that. So two things to address here. So God is not like us, human beings, in the sense that we're body and soul. And then God is not, we could say, like the angels. They are also spiritual beings, okay? But they have corporeality to them. So they are not absolute, and they are not infinite, and they are not eternal. Okay? God is infinite. God is absolute in his simplicity. So notice then that creatures are composite beings, whether they're made up of different parts, whether it be physical and spiritual, or even spiritual in corporeality. Angels have a body. It is a spiritual body, but it is a body nonetheless. God does not have a body. He's not demarcated by bounds, by confines, right? He's not restricted to a corporeality. So in that sense, God is simple. So the concept that God is simple may sound simple, but it's not. It takes some attempt at explaining and defining and confessing what is completely different from what we know in creation. That he is a spirit, not flesh. He's not composed of any parts, not even metaphysical parts. And this is something also that has been expressed by some religions or philosophies. One of the oldest religions that comes from the Far East is Zoroastrianism. It was the religion of the Persians. And they posited a God that was a combination of good and evil. This is expressed in movies such as Star Wars, right? The white force and the dark force. And it is expressed also in some of the philosophies and spiritualities of today, where it says, oh, we have a good angel on one side and a bad dark angel on the other side. And that is also the nature of all reality, the yin and the yang. That reality, the ultimate nature of reality is that God, somehow in the universe, it's that composite, metaphysical composite of good and bad. And it is necessary to have both. And that is how the cosmos, the order of the cosmos goes like that. Well, that is not the conception of the biblical God. He's pure spirit. He's not composed of parts. He's pure goodness in being and act. God is not part light and part darkness, part this and part that. God is pure and unmixed light. 1 John 1:5. Pure and unmixed being. Pure and unmixed wisdom. Pure and unmixed goodness. Pure and unmixed power. So notice that the scriptures are pure and unmixed. There is no admixture, whether it be spiritual and metaphysically, or whether it is physicality to him, obviously, let alone that. Pure and unmixed. So his absolute, all that he is God. There is no sense in which God is awaits to be completed. to be actualized, to be realized in being or act. No way in which he is like that. No way in which he could change and mutate or evolve. And by the way, this has been the direction of some heresies that are a repackaging of old heresies. But today, what's been known as open theism, which is old process theology, is that God, by virtue of his relationality with creation and with the creature, God is also growing and changing and being acted upon and being realized and actualized in some way or shape or form. Okay? So that exists out there. That by virtue of God's relation with the world and the cosmos and the creature, he's coming from some potentiality to some end. This obviously, this has roots way back in philosophy, as we have mentioned. So somehow God and creation, we are of one and the same stock in some sense. Hence, there is that give and take that affects us mutually. Okay? So it would be interesting to see how this, goes back to some ancient philosophies. I definitely see a correlation with some Platonic thought, an influence where you had the one, and then by a process of emanation of being, okay, then you went from the one and the forms of the one all the way down to a degraded form of divinity in humanity and in creation. But yet, we'll have that spark of divinity. So there's something about us in that spark of divinity that just needs to be awakened and needs to be reminded and brought into consciousness so that we may ascend again onto that union and contemplation and vision of God. So notice how here the distinction between the creator and the creature is obliterated. I'm also thinking of some perhaps more modern philosophies, right? Like the likes of Hegelianism, in which he posited some sort of a spirituality, right? That is writing in history. And by way of thesis and antithesis. Remember that? That is the stuff that undergirds Marxism that we received in Cuba, right? By way of history evolving and this spiritual principle in the world of thesis and antithesis, there is then a resolution. What's that called? Thesis, antithesis, you get? I don't recall now whether there was a word for that. And in that resolution, there has been progress. And there is a progression to an end for sure. But God is part of history. God is evolving and growing with history. So again, that is a destruction, right, of the creator and creature distinction. So hence, God is completely different from the creature in his absolute pure being, simple being, not made up of parts, whether physically or metaphysically in any sense. God is spirit. Divine simplicity, thus understood, says the author, follows from divine spirituality. God is pure spirit. Okay? Unmixed spirit. No, any questions on that point? Any questions on this point that deals with God's simplicity? Yes. That's a great point. Yeah. J- Jesus is everything that the Father is in substance and essence. However, and we're going to get to that when we get to the Trinity, okay? He is distinct from the Father in his mode of existence, okay? He is the eternally begotten Son of the Father. So he exists in what has been called filiation. Okay, the Father is not the Son is not the Father. But the Father fully and exhaustively indwells the Son, and vice versa. And the mind and the will of the Father is the same mind and the will of the Son. Okay, and that of the Spirit as well. So there is this unity of what God is and who God is as a person opens up in three subsistences, okay? And that is the relationality of the Trinity, in which they share equality of essence, of being, and of attributes, okay? So Jesus Christ takes upon himself humanity. So he takes another nature or essence, personalized in the Son of God. However, and this was addressed throughout the history of the church, because this is a great mystery, something hard to grasp. And our instinct is to confuse and blend and blur the line between creator and creature. Hence, that's what they did throughout the instinct of people in confessing the mystery of this one God that is one in three persons and three persons in one. It was to somehow either separate into two persons the person of Christ, hence Nestorianism, or to mix and to absorb one of the natures into the other. Okay? So in the case of Arianism, is to say there's no way that he can be God. So he is like God, homoousios, rather than homoousios, of the same essence and the same substance. So there, the union of God with humanity in the person of Christ was compromised. God does unite and relate to humanity. In the person of Christ, there is a real union. But that union in the person of Christ, or through, to, and with the person of Christ, does not obliterate the distinction of nature. Hence, Jesus Christ has two natures, a human, and he never stops being divine. But there is no mixture, there is no hybrid, there is no absorption of the humanity into the divinity or of the divinity into the humanity. They remain distinct. And that is the mystery of the incarnation, and that is the stuff of our redemption. That we became cut off from God in our humanity and all that we are, and God became flesh to be the human that would attain glory, glorification. How did he do that? By taking upon himself humanity, yet not compromising his divinity. By having a relationship and a union with humanity, by which now we come to commune with God, but not in the same way that God communes within himself. Because the essence of divinity and humanity remains distinct, different, separate. But we can have fellowship through the Logos that became flesh to redeem humanity And that is the mystery that we adore. And through faith, by Spirit-born and created faith, we become united with Christ. Because He has taken our place in humanity. And He has then covenantally lived the perfect life that we have not been able to live, for our forgiveness, for our justification, and then for our glorification, which means to be clothed with glory. Which glory? Not the essence of divinity, but the glorified flesh of Christ. That as He is, we will be. In fellowship with God, in union with God, in, with, and through Christ, but still distinct from the essence that God shares, indwells fully among the three persons of the triune God. I don't know if that answers your question. I'm sorry. Sure. Yeah, absolutely. No, He's not. In His essence, He is the same with the Father. He is Spirit, like the Father. These are great questions. It helps us delineate some things. In what He is just like the Father in every respect. He is Spirit. He's simple. He is of Himself. So the essence, the attributes of being and existence are shared equally by the three persons of the Trinity. They are three persons, one essence. One essence. So He then, in redemption, takes a body. Not just a body, takes a human nature, which is not just body, but it's also mind. It's also will. Everything that characterizes and is of the essence of humanity, He takes that upon Himself. He assumes that. But He assumes that, and this is the stuff, and that's why confessions and creeds, and particularly those first 4, 5, 6, 7 ecumenical councils are important. Because they address this. They gave us the language and the formulation to speak. And the Council of Chalcedon in 451, after the blunders and the heresies that had to do with the person of Christ and the Trinity, then we arrived at some formulation that does not seek to fully explain God, but to put certain boundaries, to not err and equivocate in what we say about God. And you can search that up later, the Council of Chalcedon, and what the formulation of the Council of Chalcedon when it comes as it comes to the person of Christ and His two natures. That God the Son is one person with two natures. And while those two natures communicate attributes in the person, the attributes of each nature never cross one to the other. Humanity remains human nature, and divinity remains divinity. Hence, on the side of divinity, Christ is pure spirit, like the Father. Yes? That's exactly right. And that is Arianism on the one hand, degraded divinity, an exalted creature, and Eutychianism on the other hand. What was the other? Degraded divinity or? Deified. So somehow the divine absorbed the human. You know? So these were heresies. And poor them. I mean, they were trying to You know, I have a sense of compassion for heretics because it would have been so easy to err on these matters, and now we get all the benefits of all the work that our forebears, right, have done, you know, to reason through it, to think through it, and this is all. It would seem like an abstract study, but it's not. This has all been done in the interaction with the biblical record and with what the Bible teaches about God in the economy of redemption. But the economy of redemption reveals, right, the God that is within himself, the Trinity, the ontological, intra-Trinitarian life. And hence, we confess such a God in distinction from false gods and from idolatry. We said that. In other words, say, what is the importance of this? The importance of this is that we confess that God that is, notice how we have degraded God when we depart from the knowledge of God. And then what do we do? We fragment and separate the existence of God from his being and from his attributes, so that we have gods that come into being, that become, that arise from some primordial stuff. So notice we rob God of his aseity, from being the uncaused, self-sufficient, self-existent being. Now we have gods that are arising, that are becoming, that are coming into existence, right? And then notice what these gods become. They become the expression of some aspect of creation. What does that mean? The God of the thunder, the God of the river, the God of fertility, the God of this and the God of that. So that divinity now becomes coterminous with creation. So what we have done is, idolatry is basically that we're projecting ourselves, and our existence is derived. And it's bound, and is composite, and it's not simple. And our essence is separated from existence, and our attributes, they lie in us in potentiality, and they grow, and they are developed, and are cultivated, but not so with God. So to avoid the wrong worship of God and the wrong practice and the wrong, the misapplication and lack of confidence in the God, in the true God, we need to know the doctrine of God. Yeah. Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, Jehovah's Witnesses on the one end. Now, it has all kinds of practical implications. One of the earliest heresies was Gnosticism. So if there is a spark of divinity in you, then you don't need a mediator in the flesh. What you need is to get back to the divine being and essence that lies within you dormant. Hence, there's going to come this enlightened, being that will give you the keys to awaken that knowledge and to ascend in that ladder of being unto the contemplation of God. Notice that's different. That is another gospel. It's a false gospel. By the same token, notice all kinds of implications. Arianism, Gnosticism. How about Pelagianism? Pelagianism, which, identified with Pelagius and even Nestorius. There's a connection there because there is no union of the mediator with human essence. What for? He's just two persons. And what he did is he came to show us the way, to be an example for us, not to unite himself to humanity so he could redeem it by his mediatorial substitutionary role. It's just that God that also becomes a human person to give us the example, to teach us how we ought to live so that we may then ascend ethically and morally back to God. That is an aberration of Christian doctrine. Because we are saved by union with the mediator by the Spirit of God through faith. And then by the Spirit of God through faith, we're being sanctified, and eventually we're putting off corruption and mortality because we're being raised in the image of the mediator of the last Adam. He is the head of the church. He is the one that has accomplished what we have failed to be, to become, to rise, to do before God. And it is simply by union with Him that we're justified. Not by some type of ethical and moral change, transformation. The change and the transformation is the consequence of the union. It's the reflection of the union and the apprehension by faith of our covenantal head. See all kinds of implications there? Today, with the woke church, and it's all about social justice, and it's all about, oh God, the gospel is broader than, Jesus, the mediator, and justification, and this and that. Is somehow all these things happening in society. No, it's not. It's not. That is not the gospel. The gospel is not some type of morphing of the life of God through groups, enlightened groups in the development of history. It's not like that. You see, so the right doctrine of God leads us to the right confession of truth, worship of God, and application of life. We just have to see the connections and connect the dots. And this is going to truly ground us in faith, in knowledge, in worship. And it's hard to be moved when you're grounded in the truth. What's happening in today's contemporary church, they're not grounded in truth. They're grounded in ancillary things. They're grounded in superficial things. They're grounded in temporal things. But they don't have the knowledge of God. They don't know God. Hence the importance of it. So let's move on. Number two, God is not composed of genus and species. What does that mean? As we saw in an earlier chapter, there is no larger category of gods of which the Lord is a member. Right? God is not a God among other gods. Nor do God and creatures together compose a larger category of things, beings, persons. That would be more along the lines of Platonism, right? The emanation of being, that all of reality is some sort of emanation of quality of being. No, God is of a different kind altogether. He is one kind within Himself and of Himself. There is no one like Him. God is not just a greater version of this or that kind of thing or being. The God who created all things transcends the categories of all created things. Indeed, He transcends categorization altogether. So we try to explain the attributes in a separate manner and distinguish them, but God is simple. His attributes are identical with His being. Divine simplicity, thus understood, follows from God's transcendent categorical uniqueness. God is the incomparable one. The incomparable one. The incomprehensible one. That is another term from our community. He's incomprehensible. And it doesn't mean that we can know something about Him and we can relate to Him in His self-disclosure, but to grasp God and to fully comprehend Him in his essence and in his being and in his modes of being? No. Hence, we worship him. We adore him. But we know something true about him in that disclosure of himself in redemption and in nature. Another one, God is not composed of substance and accidents. What does that mean? God does not have attributes in the way we have attributes. We possess specific attributes or qualities, such as wisdom or brown hair. They are metaphysically distinct from ourselves. The fact that you are wiser, or you have a certain IQ, or you have brown hair or blue eyes, that is not of the essence of who you are, right? So there is a distinction there that you can establish about the creature. There are accidents, and then there is the essence. God does not exist that way. We can grow or decrease in wisdom or lack wisdom altogether. Yet we still remain who we are as wiser, less wise, or unwise versions of ourselves. The color of our hair can change, or our hair can fall out altogether. And it does. Yet we still remain who we are. Many of our qualities and attributes do not inhere in us essentially. To be Scott is not essentially to be right-handed. To be Scott is not essentially to have brown hair, or even to have hair at all. It is not so with God. God is identical with the perfections we attribute to him. God is light. God is love. God is the truth. God is the life. Who God is and what God is are identical. He is who he is. Exodus 3:14. This is divine simplicity in the strict and proper sense. God is the great I am. And that's the covenantal name that he gives, right? Moses. Because this was going to set this name apart from the gods of the nations. The fragmented, distorted, humanized, idolatrous nations. Number 4, God is not composed of potentiality and act. Unlike creatures, in God there is no potential for growth, diminishment, or change. God does not gain or lose perfections. In the book there are scriptures, right, that are given for that. God is not metaphysically divisible from what he once was or what he one day will become. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Hebrews 13:8. The one who was and is to come. Revelation 4:8. With him there is no variation or shadow due to change. James 1:17. Divine simplicity, thus understood, follows from divine immutability. It's immutable. He does not change. Another way of speaking is that he's impassible. He does not have passions. That's why we say that he is pure act. He does not emote in the sense, I feel. We emote. We have passions that ebb and flow, rise. We're affected by the environment. Or we're affected from within ourselves by what we think. And then we change, right? And we become, whether it's wiser or whatever it is, whether it's holier, more righteous. We have the capacity for growth. That's the nature of being a creature. Not so with God. He's pure being, pure act. He is the sum of his attributes in simplicity. He is. He's life. He's light. God is the self-same one. Another one, and last, God is not composed of being and essence. He's not composed of being and essence. What a creature is, example, a dog, a cat, a snake, and that a creature is are metaphysically distinct. Metaphysically meaning that which has to do with existence and beyond existence. In other words, you can speak of human nature and it not exist or be instantiated in a particular person, right? You can think of creatures. An example he gives is what a creature is does not entail its existence. What a creature is does not entail its existence. In fact, we can imagine many kinds of creatures, like unicorns, that do not in fact exist, right? Now, not so with God, what God is and that God is are identical. What God is and that God is are identical. He is the one who is. Hence the name, right? He is the one who is. He is the one who is the consuming fire, who does not rely on any fuel outside himself in order to burn. God has life in himself. He is life. He exists. His life. Divine simplicity, thus understood, follows from divine self-existence. God is the self-existing one. The self-existing one. As the preceding discussion suggests, divine simplicity is not merely one divine attribute among many within the Christian doctrine of God. The attribute of divine simplicity is paradigmatic. It's the basic grammar of God's proper name, Yahweh, as revealed by God in Exodus 3:14. I am who I am. I am who I am. Divine simplicity describes how the one God has attributes. And divine simplicity, in turn, is described by describing the one God's other attributes. Let's see what else here is helpful. The doctrine of divine simplicity not only helps us better appreciate the oneness of God in His being and attributes, it also helps us better appreciate what it means for the one God to be the author and end of all things, the first and the last. All composition presupposes a composer, that a creature exists and that a creature exists and that a creature exists as a particular kind of creature instead of another kind of creature depends upon God alone. He alone calls all creatures into existence, causing them to be what they are and causing it to be that they are. Notice, creatures receive both essence and existence from God. That's the story of creation. But no one and no thing causes the one God to be who, what, or that He is. Who has caused Him to exist? Who has taught Him wisdom? Who has ever given anything to Him? The answer to all these questions is no one. Lacking a composer, God, the first cause, lacks all composition. He is a self-existent, self-wise, self-good, self-powerful God. From Him and through Him and to Him are all things. To Him be glory forever. And this final point, I think, also is very, very helpful. In similar fashion, God's identity as the final hope of His people, their supreme blessing and reward, is further illumined and underlined by the doctrine of divine simplicity. The supreme goods that God has promised us in Christ are not finally divisible from God Himself. This is very important, because this is how the creature fell, by separating the goods from the giver. The supreme goods that God has promised us in Christ are not finally divisible from God Himself. The true food for which the human soul hungers, the true drink for which the human soul thirsts, is not merely something that God gives. It is something that God himself is. Isn't that great? Yeah. It is something that God himself is. Our souls long for the living God. He is the bread of life, the soul's true food, the soul's true drink. The one and simple God, the final cause of all creatures, is himself, the soul's reward. See the implications for that? He is the gift for man. And we see that nowhere better than in redemption, where God gives himself unto us, taking upon himself human nature to bring us unto everlasting, incorruptible, and immortal fellowship with him in new creation. Amen. We will begin next class with some confessional statements to kind of round this up and move on then to some of God's personality, God's relationality, and then how we perceive those attributes, and how, the communicable attributes of God to us. Any questions or comments?